tonight. We're particularly fortunate to have with us someone who is eminently qualified to talk about the US elections and the aftermath. Executive Director of the Centre for Independent Studies, Tom Switzer. Tom's made a special visit from Sydney, I think, and we're very grateful that he could join us on this occasion in person. Tom is, of course, a regular commentator in a wide variety of forums in Australia and overseas, and especially busy in the lead up to the presidential election. May have seen excellent panel discussion with Bruce Walker at the National Press Club last month. Now, the uncertainties about the outcome in the US has given Tom a good long chance to consider his verdict, I think. And we look forward to him shedding some light on the prospects for the Biden administration and what it means for Australia's relations with the United States. Tom will speak for about 20 minutes and then he's happy to answer questions. Over to you, Tom.
Great. Do you want me to stand or can I sit? Or
As you like, as you like.
Are you okay if I sit down?
Yeah.
So I think everyone can hear.
You don't need a mic, do you?
No, that's what
I'll speak out loudly. Is that okay? Can everyone hear? Yeah.
Make the questions later, we'll use this.
Sure. Well, Heath, thank you very much, and it's great to be back. I think I've been here at the ACT branch speaking at least on 2 occasions, so this is my 3rd time, and I've spoken at the New South Wales, Queensland branches 5 times each, Perth or WA twice, Adelaide, South Australia once. I think I'm missing one. Is that Hobart?
Well, it could be Darwin.
Darwin as well, right? Okay, I'll get there. But it's great to be back, and thank you for having me. It's lovely to see you all. I want to also say it's great to talk to you before about Owen Harries. Owen Harries was a senior foreign policy advisor to Malcolm Fraser when he was Prime Minister in the late 70s and early 80s. And he commissioned, the Prime Minister commissioned Owen to write the famous Harries report on Australia's engagement with the Third World. And we've just been sharing stories about Owen. Owen was a very dear friend of mine. I wouldn't be talking about American politics or international relations if it weren't for Owen. When I was an undergraduate, I used to read Owen's articles in The National Interest, which he founded, a political magazine in Washington in the mid-1980s. And I had no interest really in politics or foreign policy. I was something of a runner, a competitive athlete, and then I busted my back, and I had about 6 months on my back recuperating from surgery, and I just devoured Owen Harries' articles. And I fell in love with American politics. So I say to young people when they go into, when they're at university and they're not enjoying political life, just give it a go and it will stimulate you. And nothing stimulates one more, I think, than the subject of American politics. Regardless of who's in the White House. It's become quite stimulatory lately for obvious reasons, but it's a subject that always intrigues one. This election, 2020 election, on the one hand you've got a rude, crude, lewd buffoon who, to put it mildly and politely, is incapable of understatement. And then on the other hand, you've got someone who's probably the most gaffe-prone political figure in modern history. And in fairness to Joe Biden, the Washington definition of a gaffe is when a politician inadvertently tells the truth. So by that criteria, he's probably one of the most honest political figures in Washington in modern times. But you've got this terrible dilemma where you have 2, frankly, ordinary candidates in their 70s. And some people say it's a bit like Henry Kissinger's quip during the Iraq-Iran war in the 1980s. That is, it's too bad both sides can't lose. Or mind you, it's weird to quip, but that is Sarah Palin, I think, at the height of the Syrian civil war. Remember Sarah Palin? Yeah. She said at the height of the Syrian civil war that America should keep out, not get involved in this Sunni Shia sectarian stoush, and let Allah sort it all out. So anyway, this has been a pretty weird contest between these 2 70-year-olds. And I think the first thing to say really about it is that congratulations to Joe Biden, not just because of the election, but because tomorrow he turns 78. And I think it's important to wish him 4 years of good health. Note that America's oldest president to date, of course, was Ronald Reagan. And he was 3 weeks shy of turning 78 when he left the Oval Office. Joe Biden's just turning 78 as he's about to go into the White House. Now, I know that the average male life expectancy in the last 40 years has improved, but still that's something to bear in mind. Biden will be the oldest president in American history. I think his victory, and it is a victory, is a great political comeback. And I say that for two reasons. One is Biden ran for president in 1988 and again in 2008, and he failed spectacularly. He ran for the Democratic presidential nominations in 88 and 2008. And then, of course, earlier this year when he ran again in the Democratic presidential primaries, he came fourth in Iowa, the Iowa caucuses, and then he came fifth in the New Hampshire primaries. Now, usually when a candidate comes fourth and fifth in Iowa and New Hampshire, whether it's the Democratic presidential primaries or the Republican presidential primaries, they're finished. They never advance. But Biden has bounced back from these terrible setbacks to be the nominee of his party and then to become president at the age of 78. I mean, that is very impressive. Personally, it's an amazing story for Joe Biden. It's a tragic story. Some of you may be aware of this, but when he was elected to the US Senate in November 1972, a few weeks after, this 29-year-old won the Senate seat in Delaware. His wife and his one-year-old daughter were killed in a car accident. And his two boys, Bo and Hunter, I think they were aged about 2 and 3, they survived, but they were severely injured. This was December 18, 1972. And little known fact, I've just broadcast this on my Radio National program, and there's actually a YouTube clip on this. President Richard Nixon, who's just been re-elected, a huge landslide victory over George McGovern. He wins 49 out of 50 states. That would never happen these days. Nixon won 49 out of 50 states. He's on the highest political mountain. Of course, he resigns in disgrace less than 2 years later. Nixon hears about this young Democratic Senate-elect Joe Biden, and he calls him up. And you can actually hear the tape. Just go Richard Nixon, Joe Biden on YouTube, or listen to my recording on Radio National online. And Nixon feels his pain. He says, this is a terrible thing that's happened to you. Everyone in the White House is thinking and praying about you. Forget the Republican-Democratic divide. We're all Americans here. We're feeling your pain. And Biden's obviously in a pretty bad way. He's choking up. It's a very, very sad story. And of course, a few years ago in 2015, Joe lost one of his two boys, Bo, to cancer. Only in his 40s. And that derailed any plans on Biden's part to run for president in 2016. So that's a personal, sad story that I think we should bear in mind. And I think it's fair to say that during Joe Biden's long political career, senator from 73 to 2008, then of course Barack Obama's vice president for 2 terms, Biden has been able to forge alliances across the political aisle. And the great hope is that he'll bring these personal powers, personal qualities to power, be able to mediate policy disputes, work with both parties to end what's really a toxic polarisation in Washington and help improve America's image abroad. And I think I can reflect the views of a lot of Australians when we hope that Joe Biden does well. So the election result itself, now that the remaining vote counts have taken place, and of course when the result is certified by Congress on December 14, it will show that the Electoral College result, this is intriguing, will be pretty much the virtual inversion of the 2016 election when Donald Trump defeated Hillary Clinton. That is 306 votes to 232. It's not the blue wave that many pundits, including myself, expected. It's certainly not the Democratic landslide that the polls predicted. The polling companies again have been repudiated in this election. There was one poll, Washington Post, ABC, which is one of the most respected public polling companies, 2 weeks out before the election. Can you believe this? They said that in Wisconsin, a battleground state, Biden was leading by 17 points. And he ended up winning by 0.1 or 0.2% of the vote. So there's been a complete repudiation of the pollsters. And what's happened here is that the Democratic majority in the House of Representatives, that's been reduced, despite the Democrats far outspending the Republicans. I think they spent more than $1 billion. The Republicans will retain control of the Senate so long as they hold on to at least one of the two runoff Senate seats in Georgia in early January. Why has the race been a lot closer than we expected? And remember, on the Wednesday 2 weeks ago, a lot of people thought that Trump was going to win again. Now, he was surpassing expectations because he won Florida and he won Ohio. And in those battleground states in the Midwest, he was leading comfortably in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. But of course, that was before the mail-in ballots, or what we call the postal ballots, came into place. And those states had a rule that those postal ballots would be counted after the actual polls closed. And that's why the Democrats, who are more likely to vote via postal, and Republicans are more likely to vote on the day, that's ultimately why the Democrats won those seats. But it was looking pretty tight there for a while. And I remember doing a bit of television and radio on the Wednesday, and no one really knew what would happen. But in the end, Biden won, but it was a close election. And the reason why, I would suggest, is that the American people rejected a radical transformation of America. Now, why do I say that? It's not because Biden himself is a man of the ideological left. Biden's a pretty pragmatic, mainstream, centre-left politician. But just as the centre of gravity in the Republican Party has lurched off to this Trumpian, populist, nativist direction, so has the centre of gravity in the Democratic Party moved to what the Americans would describe as the left of centre, a more progressive agenda. And throughout the year, Democrats openly talked about ending the 60-seat legislative filibuster in the Senate, which forestalls the need to compromise with the minority, and that would mean the creation of two new states, Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C., with two new senators who would inevitably be more liberal Democratic types. That would mean more stacking of the US Supreme Court. So instead of the 9 justices there now, the Democrats would actually add two more candidates or justices to be confirmed, and they'd be more likely to be liberal. And on top of that, legislatively, if there was a Democratic sweep of the House, the Senate, and the White House, which the polls indicated would happen, that would have meant undoubtedly higher taxes, a Green New Deal, we'll talk about that later if you like, Medicare for all, more calls to defund the police across the Union. And again, in the American context, and this is very important, we're not talking about the Australian or the European context, but in the American context, which is still very much a centre-right country, that did amount to radical, progressive, dare I say it, left change. And a lot of these folks didn't like Trump, they didn't like his polarising style of politics, his chaotic style of governance, and they may have even voted against him, but they made sure that they voted for Republicans in the House and the Senate in some of those crucial states. Trump, let's remember, won 5 million more votes than he did in 2016. He commanded 48% of the electorate. Now, it's still a minority, 48%, but bear in mind, during his presidency, for the last 4 years, he's been lucky to get above 46% in those polls. He got 48% on election day. He also, and this is intriguing, he broadened the appeal of the Republican Party to minorities. Still very much a minority of the vote, but among Hispanics, African Americans, Asians, Muslims, LGBTQI community, he even doubled their votes from 14 to 28% in 4 years. And so my sense is that although they were happy to end, as I say, Trump's chaotic style of governance and his polarising style of politics, they also remembered the pre-pandemic booming times of America that were fueled by tax cuts and deregulation, and that led to very low unemployment, rising wages, and of course a revved up stock market. So Trump's lost, but you're probably asking yourselves, why hasn't he conceded? Now, his campaign has every right to expect recounts in some of those very close state elections, and he's also entitled to fight the result in court, but ultimately his campaign needs to provide sound evidence of widespread electoral fraud, and at this stage there is just none. And I think he knows that. And I think his supporters are either know it or they're deluded. they're not going to overturn the election results. But he's still digging in. Why is he being so stubborn? And I think the answer to this lies in something that Pat Buchanan, a former Republican presidential candidate, told me last week on Radio National, that Trump is bent on payback for the Democrats, the media, the establishment, because in Trump's judgment, he's doing to them what they did to him when he won 4 years ago. So in the months, and indeed for the next 2 years after his election, this is Trump's argument, it's always important to know what your opponents are thinking. Trump believes, and his people think, that the Democrats, the outgoing Obama administration, the media, the deep state, were trying to delegitimize Trump's election by saying it was because of the Russian intervention. The Russians stole the election for Trump. And this is what motivates Trump now. He's bent on revenge, but ultimately, when all is said and done, he will leave office on January 20. Whether he actually attends the presidential inauguration, as all outgoing presidents do, when Joe Biden is sworn in as the president on midday on January 20, or 4 a.m. in the morning, January 21 our time, that remains to be seen. How will history view Trump? Well, it's very easy, and I've been one of those who says this. He's a very rude and crude and lewd person who has, frankly, debased public discourse. That's a given. But I think we should remember, why was he elected in the first place? I don't think he's the cause of America's crisis. He's a symptom of the crisis. The US is in crisis, and it's caused by forces that may have been intensified by this pandemic. But they preceded the pandemic, and they preceded Donald Trump 4 years ago. Wage stagnation, rising inequality, the socio-economic dislocation caused by globalization, technological change, all of which was exacerbated by the global financial crisis more than 10 years ago. All of that has sharpened divisions between ordinary Americans, particularly in those Rust Belt states that had a very high concentration of folks working in manufacturing, a lot of old white working class folks who usually vote Democrat. They embraced Trump. And this happened before Trump arrived on the scene. So did, by the way, that toxic political polarisation that we all too are aware of over the last 4 years. That existed before Trump. Some of you may have heard me say this in other formats, but in 2013, 2 years before Trump even arrived on the scene, Bob Gates, who served with distinction as the Defense Secretary to both Democratic President Barack Obama and Republican President George W. Bush, Bob Gates was asked, what's the greatest national security threat that the United States faces? It wasn't the Russians, it wasn't the Chinese, it wasn't the Iranians, it wasn't Sunni jihadists that became known as Islamic State. No, in Gates' judgment, the greatest national security threat that the United States faces is, quote, the 2 square miles that encompasses the White House and the Capitol building on Pennsylvania Avenue. In other words, that toxic polarisation and that hyper-partisanship, that's what constitutes the greatest national security threat to the United States. And remember, Gates said this 2 years before Trump arrived. It's clearly got worse since, hasn't it? The conventional wisdom around the world blames Donald Trump's America First nationalism for undermining the rules-based liberal international order. How often do we hear this? It's a common mantra. And he has imposed import tariffs. He has pulled the United States out of international agreements, like the Paris Climate Change Accords. He's done all these things. But the rot, I would argue, set in well before Trump came to power. And I'd go back 3 decades ago. This is an issue we can discuss in Q&A because this is a minority view probably. But I think if you go back 30 years ago, in the late 80s and early 1990s, the most consequential event of the post-war period happened. And that was, of course, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. And from that moment onwards, both Republicans and Democrats believed in the idea that America should, having won this wonderful victory, exploit what the distinguished Washington Post columnist Charles Krauthammer called the unipolar mode and embrace a policy of American global leadership, a Pax Americana, a new American century, where America would be the global hegemon that would, if you like, impose its will and influence across the Persian Gulf, across Europe, and across East Asia. And I would argue the results, with the exception of Asia, have been an unmitigated disaster, and I'll tell you why. After the 9/11 terror attacks 19 years ago, the US has spent blood and treasure on fighting these misbegotten wars in the Middle East where it had no vital interests, most notably the Iraq invasion, which Donald Trump says he opposed. Under Bill Clinton, George W. Bush and Barack Obama, Washington led efforts to expand NATO, which, remember, was created as a way of containing the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was no more. But in Brussels and in Washington, there was a conventional wisdom that emerged that America should lead efforts to expand the Atlantic Alliance right into Central and in Eastern Europe, right onto Russia's frontiers. And that just aggravated the Russians. It was in their sphere of influence. And that encouraged Putin to play hardball in Ukraine 6 years ago and protect what he sees as Russia's strategic interests in Ukraine against the West. And moreover, it actually helped push Russia closer to China, which has now emerged as clearly the greatest threat to American preeminence in the world, at least in East Asia. Meanwhile, America's belief that democracy is an export commodity. Remember going back to the late 80s and early 1990s, you had people like Francis Fukuyama, who's a friend of mine, published by Owen Harries. In fact, his essay was published by Owen Harries in the summer 1989 issue of The National Interest. He talked about the end of history, the end point in humankind's ideological evolution, the universalisation of Western liberal democracy and market capitalism. And many Democrats and Republicans took the belief that America had a moral responsibility to make the world more democratic. Well, how's that fair? So all those conditions and decisions existed before Trump. And in 2015, and indeed in 2016, it helped not just Donald Trump, but also Bernie Sanders, self-described socialist outsider. Trump, Sanders, I would argue, represent two sides of the same coin. Angry backlash against the establishment, particularly on foreign policy. So that brings me finally to America's place in the world and how we fit in. And then we'll take questions. As I've said, the Pax Americana no longer exists. And I think the rise of China has clearly challenged the notion of unipolarity in the world. And as if we in Australia need reminding during the past 6 or so months, China's love affair with the West is coming to an end. Having emerged from 2 centuries of economic and military weakness to finally master more sophisticated Western technologies, an increasingly more authoritarian China is growing rapidly and converting its economic might into military might. And not surprisingly, China's definition of its national interests is growing as its power increases. And like virtually all great powers before it, China is now wanting to seek a sphere of influence in areas on which its future security and prosperity depend. And this is certain to alarm, and indeed starting to alarm, Australians, not to mention other people around East Asia. From Beijing's perspective, and remember, Henry Kissinger famously said it's always important to know what your opponents are thinking and put yourself in the shoes of your opponents. Look at the world from their perspective. From Beijing's perspective, this makes very good strategic sense to challenge American preeminence in East Asia. It's how all rising great powers behave, even the United States. Many of you have no doubt heard of the term the Monroe Doctrine. President Monroe in the early 19th century talked about how America needed to have a sphere of influence in Latin America. And America really commands the Western Hemisphere as its sphere of influence. Well, China wants to play hardball and do the same thing. And the tragedy, as some leading foreign policy realist thinkers like Professor John Mearsheimer at the University of Chicago, Professor Stephen Walt from Harvard University, this is their argument, and I subscribe to this view, is that as Beijing asserts itself in East Asia and other regions, Washington, that does not tolerate peer competitors, will go to great lengths to stop China. And this, by the way, is probably one of the only bipartisan policy issues in Washington. Trump has upended the pro-engagement consensus in Washington. From the time of Richard Nixon and Gough Whitlam in the early 70s, right through to the time of Obama and Tony Abbott, the consensus in Canberra and Washington was to engage China. In the last few years, because mainly China has become more assertive, America, Washington, Canberra, under both Labor and Liberal parties and Democratic and Republican parties have changed their tune. So it follows that if China continues to grow, that security competition in East Asia between the United States and China will intensify. And that's likely to make this rivalry worse. And I think what will make it worse, I should say, is that Beijing is not very good at winning friends and influencing people. You could say the same thing about Donald Trump, but he's not going to be there for the next 4 years or forever again. There'll be a more competent administration in Washington that you would think would be better at what Joe Nye once called soft power. Beijing has no sense of the importance of soft power, as the wolf warrior diplomacy of China's ambassadors makes clear. And they're not just doing it to us, they're doing it to other countries around the region. It's a heavy-handed behaviour on Beijing's part, and it's seen by many as a threat to the sovereignty of countries in the region, not just Australia. So in conclusion, because we've lived in a unipolar world for the last 30 years since the end of the Cold War, and that was dominated by our closest ally, and of course because East Asia has been so peaceful during this period, we've come to think that this benign order in Asia will last forever, particularly as these countries have become more economically interdependent in an age of globalisation. We long thought that it was impossible to imagine the return of great power rivalry in the post-Cold War era. But that world has gone away, mainly because of the rise of China. And the Sino-American rivalry in the post-Trump era is likely to be a defining feature of international relations in the century ahead, and it's going to take place in our neighbourhood. Now, this is not a welcome development by any means, but it's our future. And the task now is how we in Australia deal with this intensifying security and economic competition between our largest trade partner and our most important security ally. Thank you.
About half an hour for questions. Who would like to start the ball rolling?
And please do challenge. It's important.
People can stand up and say it aloud, their name or something, and keep your questions fairly succinct. Thank you, Phil.
Step up.
Well,
Well, my name's Philip.
whichever you feel.
My name's Philip Ellison, and I've got just a couple of little points to make about that exciting, interesting, and predictive, I think, commentary you made tonight. The first one is about Donald Trump's lewdness and language and so on. I would like not to disagree with you, but I'll put a point of view, which is that the highly codified world of international relations, which you and others here who've been involved in it know, the highly codified world of even the Canberra bureaucracy, where speaking your mind is not accepted, but playing a longer game and a routine is understood. It's not understood in business circles in Australia, and indeed there's a different cultural ways of engaging with each other internationally. Donald Trump, not an internationalist, a business person whose psychology is not unknown to people who deal with business, in the sense of let's fabricate the reality, let's construct confidence, let's do this, let's erode somebody else by calumny and lie. Well, it's all standard behaviour. But it's not standard behaviour necessarily outside the codified music and theatre of international diplomacy. I think Donald Trump really just injected a different script into a standardised global domain. You know, if you go around the world and deal with, as they said, the editor of the International Herald Tribune said, look, we have 1% of the people who travel the globe read our paper. We all share the same perspectives and views. And
Cosmopolitan, liberal values, all that.
Donald Trump wasn't part of that, but he did say it like it is, and has caused an enormous adjustment by people who were quite happily travelling along, reading from the same script. NATO funding, for example, dealing with China, the reventure of the Europeans into this area. A number of things directly and indirectly associated with that. And, on the election, I'd say Trump has still got his court cases to go through. I lost quite a lot of money on the election. I punted it months early.
Did you?
I punted months early. Yes, I did, but multiply, and it was quite an enjoyable evening to see that dissipate. But nonetheless, on that election, he's just hired new lawyers, and the commentary today, as you might have seen, it's about why should such high-flying lawyers risk their entire reputation for taking on this job. Maybe it's dough, I don't know, but
he could pardon himself, perhaps.
There could still be something out there.
Yeah.
Anyhow, thank you.
Well, could you say, perhaps, Philip, that Trump represents nationalism and the International Herald Tribune and that crowd represent liberalism? And there's a real clash we're seeing right now between nationalism and liberalism. I mean, getting back to that period in the late 80s and early 90s with the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union and the rise of transnationalism and globalisation, economic interdependency, there was a feeling that nationalism had ceased to be a central legitimating idea of state power. And it pretty much was. That was certainly the feeling in Europe. But then you had the Yugoslavian Civil War. And nationalism has returned with a vengeance. And in the American context, no one is more nationalistic than Donald Trump. And I don't think those nationalist instincts are going to go away.
No.
And if you go across the European continent, you're seeing right now the rise of many nationalists, nativists, socialists, so this goes beyond ideology, who are railing against Brussels, railing against globalism, globalisation. We in Australia have been a bit immune to this because we've had 30 years of uninterrupted growth. We haven't seen the kind of wage inequality that's clearly evident in America and Britain, for example. And we've had real control of our borders. It's been a controversial policy, but we've had border protection that's boosted public confidence in our immigration system. You don't have that public confidence in many parts of Europe or in America. And that explains why nationalism has been more resurgent in America and Europe than, say, here. So I would say his language is more nationalist than liberal, and that sort of distinguishes him from other people.
Bradley, did you have a question?
Yes. Bradley Innes. Thank you very much for a very engaging speech, firstly. But I'd like to know your thoughts on, so you spoke in depth tonight about the negative factors fraying American society, yes? And those factors haven't been resolved at the moment. As President-elect Biden comes into office, do you see a further fraying society in America? And if so, how would that manifest?
Well, these are deep-seated problems that go back decades, and no one administration is going to resolve them. Sign for hope is that Biden is instinctively a pragmatic politician. He's not a polarising character. I'd say he's got even more centrist credentials than, say, Barack Obama. And assuming that the Republicans hold control of the Congress, of the Senate, it'll be led by the Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who served in the Senate since I thought 35 years. And but this will be McConnell's last term as Senate Majority Leader. Biden's only going to be around for 4 years, you'd have to think. So it's in their interests to try to do everything they can to reach a middle on some of these contentious public policy issues. So there's signs of hope. But at the same time, because of the breakdown of the established media and the proliferation of the digital media, which is a good thing ultimately, it's led to a lot more polarisation. And it's very hard for any political leader to speak above and beyond that toxic polarisation. I think that, and I said this in the Financial Review on the day of the election, the day I wrote it on the afternoon, but it appeared that night. These are probably the most divisive times in America since the 1850s, which of course led to the Civil War. I think in some respects they're actually more divisive than the late 60s, when you had the Vietnam War protests, the race riots after the assassination of Martin Luther King, the whole counterculture movement. They were pretty tumultuous times. Some of you may remember that. I was born in 71, so I don't obviously recall it, but I've studied it. It was a very divisive time in American politics, particularly the year 1968. But this polarisation of American politics has been happening for a while. It seems to have got worse. And frankly, Trump's carry-on about not conceding defeat just makes it worse, because he's sending a signal to his supporters to delegitimise the new president.
Thomas, if I could just express a little as a media commentator, what are your reflections on the role of the media in the lead up to the election and in US society now? Obviously, changes are going afoot with the rise of social media, etc. But what impact does that have on the way America does its politics?
Well, I just think that this is a minority view in journalism, in the mainstream media at least. You know, I don't say these things because I used to work at the Australian for many years, and I carry no brief from Murdoch. But it seems to me that a lot of people blame Rupert Murdoch and his major network, the Fox News channel, for this polarisation. They've contributed to it, there's no question. The Fox News channel, at least until recently, they seem to have gone off Trump in the last 2 weeks. But they've contributed to the polarisation. But the mainstream media in the United States these days has become very polarising itself. If you look at the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, CNN, MSNBC, even the major networks like the US ABC, CNBC, CBS, I think actually the public broadcasters in America are actually above it all. They don't have much of a budget, but NPR and PBS I think are pretty good, all things considered. But those other networks I mentioned and those newspapers, they've been out to get Trump right from the outset. And I don't think they've been in any way, shape or form been fair to Trump, even though Trump has made their job to be very subjective, very easy. You know, because he does lie. This Pinocchio, what do they call it? The Pinocchio index. He's got a lot of Pinocchios. But the Washington Post, the day after he was elected, they changed the masthead to say democracy does not die in darkness. Well, that's true, but why are they saying that during the Trump era? They should say that during any era. And there was a feeling among many people in the left media that Trump represented fascism. But the checks and balances in the United States have worked very well. Even when Trump had the Republican House and the Senate, he still couldn't overturn Barack Obama's healthcare legislation. So this is a roundabout way of saying, Heath, I just think that the media polarisation goes beyond left and right. Now, one of the redeeming things about a Biden victory is that those folks in the mainstream media will give him a honeymoon, and hopefully things will calm down. But now it's got beyond the mainstream media. I mean, there are all these different websites and blogs and groups now peddling this argument that there's irrefutable evidence that the election was stolen, that there's widespread electoral fraud. And to the extent that becomes an orthodoxy among Trump supporters, it's just going to further polarise the political environment. Now, we don't have that problem here. People say we have a problem. Like, I know Kevin Rudd and Malcolm Turnbull are complaining about the Murdoch media here. Trust me, it's nothing compared to the United States with respect to the polarisation that goes beyond left and right. Much worse in America. And I'd say it's probably even just as bad in Britain, but not here.
Margaret Sainsbury, I just wanted to ask you about the role of inequality. It's always seemed to me that when you have vast gaps between poor and rich, that it ends up with a certain amount of social unrest. And then you have, if you then have leaders that fire up emotive programs, you can manipulate people. That's one aspect, but I wanted to ask you, you've asked about the media, what's the economic underpinning of the power play that's going on in there? And is that a constant?
Well, I think that the economic underpinning is just a demand for different voices. So Fox News was created in 1996. I was in Washington when it was created. And it was created because there was a feeling among a lot of conservative Republicans that the mainstream media had tilted left, and there was a market for a different voice, a more centre-right media outlet.
I was really referring to multinational companies.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, the economic underpinning of the power is, I would have thought, that there are other players involved.
I refer you to an article by George Packer in the Atlantic magazine. Just put in Packer and the Atlantic. You just go to Google and you've got the answer for it. I defer to him. He's more of an expert on this question of inequality. He wrote a very substantial book on it. I try to make a point of only talking about things that I'm really on top of. Inequality in America is not my niche, and I don't know anything about these underground forces, but Packer does deal with them.
Yes, Phil, and then Patrick.
Phil Huntley, why did Trump give us an easy ride?
Australia.
Yeah, in terms of tariffs,
Yeah.
refugee deal. Is it just we're such nice blokes and don't worry about us? And Greg Norman's such a good golf player, and Joe Hockey's such a good winer and diner. I mean, why did he give us compared to NATO, Europe and whatnot?
Well, we never gave him grief. I think there was one tense moment very early on in the Trump presidency when he had a conversation with then Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull over the refugee swap deal, and that was pretty tense. I suspect that Trump was surrounded by people who said that the Australians are good guys, and if we're serious about taking the China strategic threat seriously, let's not upset them. I think he probably likes Australia. He doesn't see us as freeloaders. I think in fairness to Trump, when he came to power, and Obama, although Obama and Trump obviously expressed themselves in different ways, they didn't like the notion of American global leadership, and they particularly didn't like the idea of US ally partners not spending their fair share on defence. So there's a 2% of GDP threshold that really should be mandatory for all US allies to spend on defence. And in the in NATO, in Europe, I think before Trump came on the scene, 26 out of 28, I might be wrong in the detail, were paying well less than 2%. And Trump's got most of them to spend a lot more, and that's in America's interest. I think Australia, over the last 6 years, Abbott, Turnbull and Morrison have got it up to 2%. So that wouldn't have aggravated him the way that, say, Japan and South Korea freeloading on the American security umbrella. That's my sense, at least.
Patrick.
If we can assume for a moment that some commentators have espoused the thesis that tensions in American society have been the conflict between the Puritans in the Northeast in the 17th century, and then later a separate strand espousing the ideas of the European Enlightenment. Let's assume that there's been a conflict and a tension between those two ideas, and they've worked themselves out in various ways. Would you like to comment on the impact of the victims of globalisation, which we've seen in the Rust Belt states.
Yeah.
What are they going to do to that historic tension? Well, are they irrelevant or are they overarching? They're not going to go away. Are they going to have a continuing and long-term impact on American life, obviously, and politics? And in what way? And with what consequences to the American polity?
Yeah. Well, some of those folks, the so-called white working class voters in those Rust Belt states, so Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, but Wisconsin, last time it voted Republican at the presidential election before Trump in 2016 was Reagan in '84. Michigan before Trump in 2016, the last time it voted Republican was Bush in '88. And then Pennsylvania, before Trump in 2016, the last time it voted Republican was '88 under Bush. So these have become the so-called blue wall, the Democrat machine, if you like. That's their last gasp. And Trump didn't smash, he smashed it, but he wouldn't by a huge margin, but he beat Hillary Clinton in there. Because Hillary just assumed that they'd vote for her. She didn't even campaign in Wisconsin. Trump did. And the guy to keep an eye on this question is someone I don't usually agree with, but he's a very, very shrewd operator when it comes to understanding American politics, and that's the left-wing documentary maker Michael Moore. Because he said throughout 2016, Trump will win the election. And all the commentators, including people like me, just said there's no way. Demography's against Trump, the minorities, the rise of minority vote, the electoral arithmetic, never mind Trump's polarising, crude style of politics. But Moore kept saying he's going to win Michigan, where Michael Moore's from, Flint, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. And he said he might even win Minnesota, which is also a very democratic state. Trump did very well there in 2016. Did pretty well there this year. And Michael Moore's argument is that the reason why Trump has resonated with a lot of these white working class folks is that during the last 30 years, they've seen their standard of living decline. They've seen wage inequality increase. They've seen their jobs shift off to Mexico and many parts of East Asia, where the costs of labour are a lot cheaper. They've had young men and women lose their lives in these endless wars in the Middle East that didn't affect America's national interests. And Trump resonates with these folks. And to some extent, so does Bernie Sanders. But Trump has something over Bernie Sanders, in that Trump rails against this identity politics that's gripping the Democratic Party. When I say identity politics, this relatively new thing to divide people by race and religion and gender. And who are the losers of identity politics? A lot of white working class folks. So they're copying it on both ends. They're copying it on the economic front and they're copying it on the cultural front. And here's Trump, who feels their pain on both economics and cultural issues. He's railing against the economic elites in Wall Street who are taking away their jobs to Mexico and East Asia. But he's also feeling their pain because he's railing against this identity politics and ghastly cancel culture that thinks that everything about Western civilization is evil. That really resonates with a lot of those white working class folks. And by the way, you're seeing the same phenomenon in Britain. Boris Johnson, a Tory, smashed the red wall of all those Labour constituencies in Northern England and the Midlands a year ago because he appealed to them on cultural values. And to a lesser extent, we could argue, less so here, that Morrison did the same thing in Northern Tasmania, Western Sydney, and many parts of Queensland in May last year. This is a values issue, and these Conservatives, though they express themselves in different ways, that's their way of winning over those white working class folks. I hope that explains.
Well, we might take one more question. Malcolm, you've got the floor.
Well, can I just...
G'day, Malcolm. Good to see you,
Hi,
mate.
how are you?
Very
Can
good.
I just make the observation, it seems to me, this is an excellent result for Biden because he's won the election with 5 million more votes than Trump, and Trump is going to be a has-been, failed president now, he will be that. But it's a very poor result for the Democratic Party. So that being the case, all Biden needs to do surely is to govern from the centre, and then the Democratic Party would be very, very likely to win the presidency next time, wouldn't it?
Well, there's a very good piece in the Wall Street Journal yesterday by a former Republican Senator, Phil Gramm from Texas, who makes exactly that point. And his benchmark for an historical analogy, I know you love your history, Malcolm, is 1994. So Clinton was elected, Bill Clinton defeated George H.W. Bush in 1992. He had the Democrats controlling the House and the Senate, moved a bit to the left in the American terms. He got smashed at the congressional elections in 1994. Remember Newt Gingrich's revolutionaries? What did Clinton do? He moved to the centre and he governed with Senator Bob Dole and Newt Gingrich in the Congress, and they passed all sorts of good legislation.
Yeah.
They were the days. They balanced the budget, debt was coming down, America's prestige and credibility in the world was at an all-time high. That was President Bill Clinton who did exactly what you just suggested. Now, whether that can work now, as we discussed before, I mean, McConnell is leading the Republicans in the Senate. He might be up for some grand bargains, and that would be a great thing for America and the world. But again, you've still got to deal with this question, toxic polarisation that existed before Donald Trump. There's no evidence that it's leaving anytime soon.
Tom, just let me ask, been praying in my mind, what if human frailty doesn't give Joe Biden 4 years? And we've got the Vice President Kamala Harris coming in. What are the
It's a very good
ramifications
question.
for US governance?
Well, she's a very pragmatic legislator. She ran to the left of the Democratic Party during the primaries, so she was trying to capture the same constituency that Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren were yearning for. But then that didn't work for her, which is odd because I think she's a very good campaigner. She's exceedingly intelligent and articulate. She holds her own in a debate. But that didn't work out well for her. And then when she was appointed, selected as Joe Biden's running mate, she moved to the centre. And so you could say that the power of her reverse gear and U-turn is up to best international standards, which is a good thing. She's a pragmatic.
She's been finger pumping Mitch McConnell in the chamber too.
Yeah, that's right. And the other thing I'd say this about her is that we all too often hear with the Black Lives Matter that America is institutionally racist or endemically racist. Well, here's a lady, a living refutation of that argument, living embodiment of the idea of American upward mobility for immigrants. Her father came from Jamaica in the 60s. The mother came from India in the 60s, when America was a less racially tolerant country than it is today. And her mother became a very distinguished cancer research intellectual at the University of California, Berkeley. And her father became a distinguished economist at Stanford University. They broke up. They raised this young lady, and now she's going to be the next vice president of the United States, the first female vice president, and she also happens to be a minority. Isn't that a great thing for America?
Ladies and gentlemen, we might put a line up there. Tom, it's always great to have you back in the branch.
That's
And
it.
hope it's not another 4 years, but we'll see you back before then, of course. And it's been very illuminating. So on behalf of everyone here tonight, I'd like to thank you for...
Thank you, Heath. Thanks for the invitation. Thank you very much.